Greetings, dear viewer. Today we're going to be talking about itemization, and in particular, how to create optimal item sets. And for this particular challenge, we have a special guest today, the head coach of Nord Esports, coming in from a beautiful victory versus Los Ratons. And this is John. Say hi.
Hey guys. excited to get into it.
Yeah, congratulations on your recent victory. And I want to mention that we've been working together a little bit, trying to get some good data for the guys in Nord Esports, optimizing their item builds a little bit. And that's the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And just as a basic guideline of what we're doing, we're going to be creating for a couple of champions an item set from scratch. And I'm going to be trying to explain my thought process where I'm creating items. The reason why I want to talk about this is because I've gotten a lot of questions about my item set in my videos, because I have a very particular way of organizing item sets. And I think there's a lot to be optimized in terms of gameplay, where you've kind of made the strategic choices beforehand. And then when it comes to time to actually play the game, you can just execute on your pre-made choices. You have a couple of different paths, and then you have some situational options. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I would like to start maybe by asking John if the professional players that you've worked with use item sets at all, or is it mostly just player kind of head information where they remember their builds?
Yeah, they don't generally. I know some people do, but in general we don't. And we don't use it like you were just showing there, which I think is really, really useful. So from a coaching point of view, anytime we can kind of front load the thinking and the decision making, so you do it before you get into a match, that's always going to be useful, because you would think, okay, it can't be that hard.
Yeah.
But not only obviously should you flex a lot, but then when you're on stage under pressure, I've been in games where before it was impossible to do, someone bought 2 shielding items, Sterax and Hex Drinker, so they just cancel each other out, or 2 different Sheen items and stuff like that. And you would never do it in a non-pressure game, but it's always better from a coaching point of view to just front load that thinking so that you can be a lot more efficient with the whole process.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I think I've seen this mistake, and it's easy as an outside person to laugh at this. You're going to be like, well, these guys are being paid, hundreds of thousands of dollars to play League, and then they can't even get their itemization right. But when it comes down to a professional game, there's so many different things that you're thinking about. It's very easy to slip up on a mistake that kind of like would be considered foolish, but at the moment you're just thinking, I just need to buy something right now. I already have a, let's say, Iceborne Gauntlet on, I don't know what would be a good example, but in the past you used to be able to buy Trinity and Iceborne Gauntlet, and maybe a Jax could have bought both, so then one of them gets cancelled out. But then nowadays the mistakes is something like not buying Lord Dominic's Regards, or let's say buying Merc Threads versus a full AD comp, stuff like this, like just mistakes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And kind of to support this process, we are going to look at data from Coachless, and specifically in the latest update that we released yesterday, we have now data on first purchases. So these are items that are, let's say, epic items or large components, because Riot's categorization doesn't include, for example, BF Sword as a epic item, since it's just a basic component. So for ADC champions such as Caitlyn, stuff like BF Sword would not be included if you only thought about epic items. But basically, in the first purchase slot here, what we have is the estimate of the win probability added, which is our metric for comparing items for every kind of large enough component purchase in the early game. And what we can see here already is that Caitlyn players previously have been abusing this Symbiotic Souls build. It is nerfed in 15.9 though, as mentioned here. It has been adjusted, that patch. But what we are going to do first is we're going to look at Shen itemization, because that's the champion that I have the most experience on. And I'm just going to walk through kind of my thought process here. Because I think most people, what they do, if they even create an item set, they kind of go like this. They're like, okay, well, nowadays xPetu has been saying that Deadman's Plate is good, so I'm gonna put Deadman's Plate there, and then, sometimes you have to go Sunfire, sometimes you go Hollow Radiance, and then they go like, I don't know, what are some health items, and then maybe put a couple of these. Sometimes you can go Stridebreaker, sure, Titanic, and then kind of fill this up with some random items.
Yeah.
And that's like
And it starts becoming not even a set because there's
yeah,
so
yeah,
many different
exactly,
choices
exactly.
there.
Yeah, there's too many choices. So I think it's like valid. It's probably better to like have gone through the items beforehand and know kind of like, okay, these are the items that my champion can buy, right? But what I want to do is I want to create specific builds for specific scenarios. So in particular for Shen, what I'm looking at first of all is what is going to be my first legendary item. I think that's the most important choice that you're going to go into a game. And this one is, I think, heavily matchup dependent. And what I think is that you should try to choose one of the kind of like statistically supported best first items and then combine that with your knowledge as the champion, expert or a pro player. You're like, okay, I've built this item before, it's good. And here we can already see that if we think about what items are good on Shen, you can see that Dead Man's Blade and Titanic Hydra both are good first item options. And we can create builds around these two options. So in my preferred way, we will look at Dead Man's Blade first. And here's actually a kind of like innuendo, like small innuendo here is that Titanic Hydra and Dead Man's Blade, the stat that we measure here, the win probability added, it is the best the best estimate of the item's impact after it has been completed. So what this says is that when you press that button here on Titanic Hydra and actually complete the item that costs 3,300 gold, how much does that usually increase your win probability? But what this number does not yet kind of explain is how do you get to that point, right? Like how good is the build path? And the first purchase slot here is going to give us a little bit of like information about that. And why I want to highlight this is that even though Titanic Hydra here has the highest win probability added, it might be a little bit flawed because of the fact that Tiamat is so bad on Shen. Tiamat in general is an item that doesn't have that many stats, but there are some good users like, let's say, Fiora, for example. I know for a fact that Fiora would love to rush Tiamat in most games, just because Fiora makes much better use of the AD than Shen. Shen doesn't have any AD scalings. So if we now choose to go Dead Man's Blade route, and here Dead Man's Blade obviously having armor, we can just qualitatively think that, okay, well, it's an armor item, it's gonna be good versus physical damage opponents. So I'm gonna try to create a path around Dead Man's Blade. And first thing I do is I will drag Dead Man's Blade into the block here, and then I will start thinking about, okay, what is gonna be my build path towards Dead Man's Blade? Because in the early game, most of your backs are gonna be on components, like for the first 15 minutes, right? Your first item is typically completed, after maybe 13, 12 minutes. This depends a little bit on pro play. And then I start wondering that, okay, well, what is the best component for me to buy early, right? And if we do not filter by Dead Man's Blade, but just in general look at all Shen games, we notice that Winged Moonblade is really high up here. And this kind of corresponds with my understanding of Winged Moonblade, because if we take a look at, this is one of my most used resources, League of Legends Wiki. If you look at Winged Moonblade and the patch history on this item, what happened in 14.9 here is that its health got increased to 200, and it only lost 1% movement speed. And this is the big itemization patch where almost every item was nerfed. So while other items and components were nerfed, this item received a buff. And even though gold efficiency is like a little bit of a flawed metric, I still look for it in terms of components, because these components don't have any unique effects, right? So it's easy to compare something like Bami's Cinder and Winged Moonblade, because all they do is give stats. So what we can notice is that you're paying 900 gold for an item that gives you the same health as Ruby Crystal. And even though Bami's Cinder is really valuable, in the first back, it might be more valuable to get that extra HP and that movement speed to trade with your opponent. Now, I might be going into too much detail here about Shen itemization in particular, but probably the more like general approach that I want to highlight is that you should be thinking about, okay, what's going to be my first legendary? And then the next question is, what's going to be the strongest component towards that legendary? And in my mind, that's always going to be Winged Moonblade in most cases.
No, I really like it.
Yeah.
I think that's also one of the differences that you see working with players, not just pro to solo queue players, but sort of challenger master players to even diamond players, like considering the components to actually be a super valuable step along the process. So there's plenty of items that we see built in pro play, and even when they're completed, they're not necessarily the best item to have completed, but it's because the build path was necessary for that moment. You know,
Yeah.
in Pro, it's even more simple. So it's like, okay, before third dragon, I do 2.5 items, and it's like, okay, so the half item needs to be a useful half.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think there's lots of examples of components that actually influence the game a lot. I think Tiamat was used previously here as a negative example, but if you think about mid-game or some like second item spike, having Tiamat on Trundle versus not having Tiamat on Trundle might be the difference between getting that tower. As we saw in the game versus Lost Tones, after you got Tiamat on Trundle, the towers just started falling. So these small items can have a huge impact on how the game rolls out. What I used on Twitter as an example was Garen's early itemization, because Berserker Greaves have for a long time been this kind of like de facto purchase on Garen, I think. Like most people just default, oh yeah, Garen for ease, spin damage, you go Berserker Greaves. And this is a remnant behavior of like old times where Berserker Greaves used to be more gold efficient. And I think it's really important to always keep up to date with changes. Obviously, I think most pro players read the patch notes, but you can see here, 25% attack speed, 45 movement speed, pretty good. But what this item used to be is used to be 35 attack speed on first item, and then there's 10 attack speed more for the same gold. So it was a very different item that provided a lot more damage. So nowadays, it's very important to just think about these item purchases and think about what's the most up-to-date information that you have. Statistics helps with that, playing the game helps with that, reading patch notes helps with that. So that's something I wanted to highlight. And then even going into more micro-itemization, the way I usually build now the item set around these two, so the first component and the first legendary, is I then break it into the smallest components possible. And the reason I do this is that when I take a recall, I instantly have visible all the components that I would be interested in buying on a back. Because even if my objective is to go for Winged Moonblade as my first purchase, it might be that the gold amount on the recall is, for example, 700. And if that's the case, I can think about going for boots plus ruby crystal or cloth armor plus ruby crystal, because these will be eventually working towards the Dead Man's Blade. And my personal preference is that I basically take all of the large components of the first legendary item and purposely put them in the item set. This is maybe a little bit of overkill, but because I'm playing Shen most of the time, I have many situations where I need to recall and instantly ultimate or teleport, for example. With top laners obviously utilizing teleport, you need to be ready to buy the items as soon as possible, because it can be the difference between losing like 1 or 2 minions. If you're waiting in base, for 5 seconds more and you lose 1 experience, this 1 experience might be caused because you took too much time to find the items that you want from the item shop. So that's why I do this. I don't know if this is something that pro players think about or something that you've thought about, kind of like.
I think first components and backs they think about a lot. And there's a lot of times where we'll like force people to stay. I mean, bot lane is the one that's the kind of, I think the one where it happens the most.
Yeah.
We have people like Ezreal and versus a person who wants to get BF sword, for example.
Yeah.
And it becomes actually quite a big game of like, okay, can you get to base for Shen, or can you even get to base for tier first? And if not, like if they ever, sometimes there'll be a situation where the Ezreal player, for example, gets a perfect opportunity to get a really nice back. Maybe they've already got a back for the tier and they want a back for the Shen, or they want a back just for the Shen and skip the tier for now for that early power, like we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
And if their base gets stopped by the BF sword user, it can be like that changes the lane completely.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
now by the time they're both back, now you're getting BF, and then suddenly you don't have that extra window where you can be really punishing. So in terms of building item sets, I don't know many pros, if any. I've not seen them that build it like that. But absolutely, it's a massive component of the game at the highest level. What you can get on backs, especially first back, like you're showing, and how big it is to kind of force someone back early, and especially if you're a person who's going to be building, let's say, even a Dirk item first on AD, we can be more aggressive on early trades because you can always go back and get a longsword if both people need to base. Whereas if the BF sword user can't even get a pickaxe, if we play really aggressively on second and third wave, sometimes it can be a really good strategy to consider.
Yeah, 100%. I think BF sword is one of probably the greatest examples, just because it is so
big. It's
it's so big. It's 1,300 gold and it's super hard to finish. But also, if you just think about it, like in terms of stat efficiency, the BF sword is just it gives more AD than similar items, right? So if the conversion is just you pay some gold to get X amount of AD, this guy gives you just more AD than any other item in the game, like component wise. So if you're able to reach that threshold of 1,300 gold, then you're basically just getting an extra reward for that. So even if, like, on paper, the actual trading that's happening in game is like, okay, let's think both players lose the same amount of HP, both players stay in lane for the exact same duration, depending on the itemization of the champion, that might result in an advantage for the opponent. So there's like hidden asymmetries that stem from actual itemization and not so much the champion itself.
Yeah, and that's where you see people like Hillesang or Mickey walk forward and ignite someone under tower.
Exactly.
It'll either be to stop them being on time for a swap, or it'll be to mess up their items.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. And I love that, because that's something that might be overlooked as a viewer. Like, okay, well, he just stopped the base. But there was more thought process behind that. I'm going to stop the base here so that both players remain in lane for longer in order to reach that item spike. To return to the topic of the Shen build here, I'm just going to drop in a Bummy Cinder here afterwards. This is where comes like your personal understanding of the game. Your understanding of your champion, your understanding of the game, where Bummy Cinder, it's a good item on Shen. The reason why we mix it into this build is that we can earlier get opportunities for ultimates when we have that wave clear. So it's perfectly fine to rush Deadman's Blade on its own, but just what I've noticed from playing is that usually you miss out some ultimate opportunities, or versus harder matchups where the opponents are pushing the wave really fast. You just need this in order to have some kind of priority. And then the build order still remains like, I want to go Winged Moonblade first, and then I want to mix in that personal preference of Bummy Cinder, finish up my Deadman's Blade. And I think here is now the question, okay, I finished Deadman's Blade. What's going to be the divergent build path after this item? And for a long time, I built Hollow Radiance. But now Hollow Radiance has been changed quite differently. And this is where I'm going to look at more general stats. So in addition to looking at your champion-specific stats and how good of a user your champion is for a particular item, I generally want to think about, okay, what is the general balance trend of different items? And if we identify that, okay, Hollow Radiance is like generally just here worse than the alternatives. Like, it's just a worse item balance-wise. This is basically looking at all champions across the board for last 3 patches. And if we see that there's a kind of systemic bias where Sunfire just is a better item, or then we can think about AD Bruiser items such as Titanic Hydra, then I might not prefer this item even if my champion would be a good user of it. I think it's like important to clarify these two things, where I think some champions, people kind of default to specific items because you think, oh, well, surely this champion must use this item. I'm trying to come up with an example so that we can illustrate this in conversation more, but I think stuff like, I'm going to look for a bad item on purpose. Maybe an item such as like Experimental Hexblade, where I think some champions synergize extremely well with this. Maybe a Zeri, Nocturne. Nocturne is a perfect example, actually. So let's look at Nocturne. So we know for a fact that this item is just across the board kind of bad. It's just statistically not as good as the other items, and there's many reasons for that, but particularly the build path and how the effect actually works. And then we think about Nocturne, it's like, oh, well surely like Nocturne is gonna be a good Experimental Hexblade user. Do you see it? Okay, it's in the C tier here. But just because your champion synergizes well with the item doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best item to buy. Because there might be an item that doesn't have as much synergy with your champion, like Stridebreaker, which, I mean, has a good synergy with Nocturne, but it's just overall in a better state. I think this is, I don't know if this point makes sense, but kind of like disentangling those two things.
Yeah. So how would you go about weighting those things? Because if, let's say, experimental hexplate, if you went onto Nocturne and it was actually dramatically increasing your win probability, let's say it wasn't minus 0.9, let's say it was 1.7.
Yeah.
Is that not enough stats in itself? Does it matter how bad the item
I
is?
would say if you have a good sample size, basically by sample size we mean the amount of games that have been played, and basically if you're like, oh, we have good evidence that even though this item is bad in general, on this particular champion, it's good enough to warrant, then by all means go for it. But if you have, let's say, any doubts about it, like, hey, I mean, I see some synergy there, but the item is overall in a bad state, and then you get evidence like this where basically we're just looking at Nocturne first item, and you see a massive difference, almost 1%. And so to some people this might sound, okay, 1%, is that really gonna matter? But if you think about every item choice as an incremental kind of like optimization game, if you every time gain a 1% lead, then over the course of 100 games, you just make those itemization choices. It's huge. That's the difference between you as a solo queue player being in Grandmaster or being in low diamond, right? Or even like gold and diamond or something like this. So obviously I'm not saying that just by buying better items you're going to become a diamond player. What I'm saying is that there's like small optimizations to be made that can have a huge impact in the long term. Yeah. Now I'm going to speed up here on the Shen part, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill in after my kind of like research. I'm playing the game a lot, I'm playing Shen a lot, I'm looking at different builds, I'm looking at stats, then I'm going to come up with, okay, well, I really like to go Spectral Skull next here. And the reason why Spectral Skull is really good with Deadman's Blade is that you've invested a lot of money into armor, and in 90% of the league games, you're going to have at least one AP champion on the enemy team. There's going to be magic damage, the magic damage that comes in, and you want to deal with that magic damage somehow, especially since Shen has innate tools in his kit to deal with auto attacks through his W, but he doesn't have a way to reduce magic damage. So getting a little bit of magic resistance is going to be really good. And this is going to be, again, kind of a situation where I think sometimes it's good to buy a component and not finish it. I was talking with Jankos, the jungler of Nord Esports now, about Spectral Skull in particular, where we were talking about Mundo itemization. And obviously Mundo players would, love to say that Spirit Visage is part of their core build because, it's Mundo, right? You have
increases healing.
Most healing in the entire game. Like surely Spirit Visage will be good. And I do agree with that point, but there's some games where...
It's the hexplate example again. It's so well with the champion.
Yeah, exactly. There's some games where you can be like, oh, I really want the increased healing. But you have to think about the trade-off that you're making. Okay, I'm using 2,700 gold to get the increased healing, but it's also gold away from armor. And let's say the opponents are working with a very physical damage-heavy composition, and the magic damage dealer is someone who doesn't want to waste their burst on a Mundo, right? In many cases, there can be a single target mage or like a very like snipe heavy mage, let's say a Seraph or something. The Seraph is not going to be hitting the Mundo. The Seraph is going to try to ult the small HP priority targets in the backline. So it can be okay to overgo the magic resistance, overgo the healing in order to get an item that better suits the needs of your champion. And in this case, it might be warranted to just go for a Spectral Skull and not upgrade it into anything. Just get a little bit of magic resistance and then move on to items that have better priority for you. Any thoughts that arise from this? I think components in general, there are cases where one should think about the league items as like, okay, you have to use gold to get a specific amount of stats, but it's also how do I use the slots in my inventory efficiently? So in the early game, you can afford to use more of the slots, but when you get to later on, like you have 4 slots filled, you can't just buy a Spectral Skull because it's gonna fill, it's gonna fill your entire inventory, right?
I don't know if it's too distracting, but the thing that as in off topic, but the thing that it instantly reminded me of is the 2 things that have happened recently with this haunting Guise.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
and the Giant's Belt versus Heartsteel situation. So how is there a way that you can bring in some stats to this, or like because four haunting guises surely is too rare an occurrence.
I know what you're talking about. Now I'm gonna have to stomp on the haunting guys abusers right here. So I've seen this build on Zyra. Do you know other users of it?
I've seen it on Lilia. I've seen it a couple of times on Singed, but obviously that's way less picked in pro play.
Yeah.
I've seen it on Akali, 2 or 3 haunting guises. Although to be fair, in the Akali game, I think it was also versus loads of squishies.
Yeah.
And he went Conqueror and 3 haunting guises, which I think was just a terrible choice.
Yeah.
No matter what you're going.
So I think it's hard to evaluate the whole kind of like just say, okay, 4 haunting guises, is it worth it or not? What we can do is we can try to estimate how good of an item haunting guise is, and then make our judgments from there. So if you're looking at the aforementioned champions, we look Rumble, then we see Zyra, and we look at the haunting guise as a first purchase, then Lilia as well. We see that it's pretty low there. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking from like my own game understanding is that, okay, well, this item increases damage percentually, right? You're in the early game, your champion's base abilities don't have, like, base damages are not that high. You don't have that much AP. Is it worth to itemize percentage increases? Someone is gonna say, okay, well, you're missing the point because the haunting guys damage multiplications are scaling multiplicatively, so you get more and more damage increases as you get more and more haunting guises. And that's a fine point to make. We don't see that in the stats because we are looking at an individual haunting guise. But if we compare that to something like a Fated Ashes, which if we assume that the items are relatively evenly balanced, which is not always the case in League of Legends, I would choose in the early game the item that gives you flat damage, instead of something that gives you percentage amplification on abilities that have low base damage. Early game, right? And then items such as Lion Restorement, which increase kind of your damage output significantly, you start to think about the trade-off. So first of all, okay, I'm not going Fated Ashes, so I'm missing out on the flat damage. I'm not completing my haunting guys into a Lion Restorement, so I'm not getting the maximum health burn on jungle monsters. And jungle monsters have a very high base HP. So getting a free 6% target max burn on any jungle, I think if we look at any kind of like AP jungler, we're going to notice that the Lion Restorement finish is like super good on them. What was the... did we look at Zyra and then Lilia?
Zyra, Lilia,
and this can be seen here, like most champions abuse Lion Restorement very well, and even top laners, I think Akali top lane, Lion Restorement is pretty high up there. This item is just very good, and you're basically making a trade-off where, like, in theory it sounds very good to be like, oh, they stack up multiplicatively, Riot, this is so OP, but then you're missing out on a lot of good items that you're not completing.
I think it's also people thinking a little bit like Riot was 5-10 years ago, or maybe even more. That shows how old I am. I was thinking that there was a preseason where they made Black Cleaver shred armor, and the armor shred wasn't unique, and so 6 Black Cleavers became a legitimately one-shot build, and they're just really waiting and hoping for those days to be back.
That could be the case. And I'm obviously not saying that you should always ignore these kinds of builds. I'm saying you should test it out. You should look at stats. You should see what one tricks are doing. I think that's kind of my holy trinity. So the websites, and this website I'm not in particular kind of like affiliated with, but I do love the One Tricks GG website. This is something that I use a lot. So when I just want to get a very fast understanding of, okay, what are best Kassadin players in the world building, I usually look at from this website. It's just a very nice interface, and this is mostly optimized for looking at builds very quickly because they look like they show these kind of item sets, and you get a good understanding of what's the meta build, right? So One Tricks, your own gameplay understanding, and then stats. Obviously, I'm biased towards Coachless because I think these stats you cannot get from anywhere else. But I think any stat website will kind of fulfill that role if you believe that their stats are reliable. So,
yeah, but of course, Coachless is the best one.
Yes, you heard it from the man himself.
I can say it because you can't really.
Exactly. So I'm gonna finish up here so that we don't spend too much time on Shen itemization in particular. I'm just gonna go to my previous item set. So that's kind of the logic where I'm like thinking first legendary. I'm thinking what is my first component. I'm gonna put in some small items. in order to have those fast backs so that I don't lose XP when I'm TPing directly out of base. And what the end result will look like is something like this, where I have a pre-planned item build. Notice here actually a small detail that I think is important. What I've done here is that item sets have the ability to select a preferred slot for each item. And I think this is that.
I like that.
Yeah, this is something
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, do people know that? Do people use this?
It could be that they do.
Yeah.
I'm I guess even a strange example as a coach. I don't play the game almost at all. I play Arena because it's fun. But I didn't know this.
Yeah.
So it could be that people do. And I actually do remember times where someone has wasted his Onyas because it was on the slot that wars normally go on.
Yes, exactly.
Or whatever it might be.
And now this is again, like someone is going to be thinking, xPetu, like, listen, man, I'm stuck in gold 3. Putting my Tiamat on number 1 key automatically is not going to get me out of that elo. And that's completely valid point. Okay, this is some Twitter feedback that I got recently. But if you're trying to push for that minimal advantage, you're at a competitive level, you're trying to gain advantages anywhere you can, then in my philosophy, there's no reason why you shouldn't do something that is zero cost, minimal cost for you, like just to set up the item page, put your items in order, put your preferred slots there to get that small incremental advantage in the game. So that's the way I'm thinking. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper. You might think, xPetu, why are your boots and your cloth armors being set to these positions? And this is where we look at the room page that I'm running. Okay, I'm running biscuit delivery. And when I come from base, I need to know that there's going to be nothing on my 3 slot, because I want to use my biscuit.
That's smart.
I want to use my biscuit from 3 slot. So I need to make sure that all my components are going down. My Doran shield is going to be in my number 1 place, so that's always fulfilled. My refillable potion or health potion is going to be in this number 2 slot. And then my biscuits are going to always drop into the 3 slot automatically, because that's going to be free and all the components are behind it. So
I love that.
So and I swear there's gonna be one game in 100 games where you lose in 1v1 because your biscuits were on the wrong key. It might be even be more often. So this is
biscuits definitely more often. I think that's a really, really good idea. I mean, obviously, feel free in the edit to cut out this rant, but
no.
we talked about the first, when we first started talking about like how important items are, and the thing you were just saying, like, is it going to get you out of gold putting your item on the right slot? A really big thing for me in my approach to high performance and my approach to coaching in general is this idea of marginal gains, which if you ever want to Google, you can fall down the rabbit hole of that. It's something that people talk about all the time. Yeah. It was very famous by a guy called Sir Dave Brailsford. And I think the best way to describe it, which was actually one of the riders who talked about it rather than the coach himself, is that we come in with the idea that nothing is too small to be considered. Yeah. It's not that we should do everything, because you only have a certain amount of time in the day, to build these item slots or anything like that. And it's not that we should do everything because it might cost something. But something like this, which putting it on the right slot costs you so little if you think about your time spent playing League in total. Exactly. Let alone in a year.
It's going to take you 20 minutes to set this item page up, and then you're going to play League for, let's say, 500 hours. So
yeah, exactly.
You're going to use very minuscule percentile of that.
Yeah, and the where items get placed is the perfect example of this kind of philosophy. It's like, okay, it's going to make such a minute difference that people will say it's not worth trying. But really the way to think about it is, what's the cost of doing it, which is a couple of seconds. Yeah. And therefore, there's just no reason not to.
And more importantly, a couple of seconds away from the game, right? Not during the game. So you're not even wasting your in-game decision-making time. You're actually creating in-game decision-making time, which for pro players is really important.
You can do this in queue if you want.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not realistically, like, I'm gonna be honest, I know 95% of the players, me included, you're browsing YouTube shorts while you're in queue. So you might as well be using
you're busy.
You might as well be optimizing your item preferred placement, like. And then I'm gonna run through here. The idea here, what I have is just I'm gonna have refillable potion in there. I don't usually like to buy this item, but in the aforementioned case where, let's say, I have to take a recall on 650 gold. 650 gold for Shen in particular is kind of awkward because you're like, oh, well, what should I buy? I mean, you can go boots, cloth armor, okay, you can go a health potion, or then you can go ruby crystal and refillable potion. You're leaving 100 gold unutilized, but ruby crystal is the best component in the early game for Shen because he benefits from HP, and you're just gonna have to buy something in addition to that in order to be stronger in the early game. I think there's an argument to be made for skipping refillable potion totally, but then you're leaving 250 gold unused. So it's in the early game, that kind of things matters a lot. So that's why I have this kind of like first slot here, which by the way, having 10 items fills an entire row on the actual league client, like the league shop in game. So this is why I always have 10 items in a block, because otherwise they will flow to the next row, and this doesn't matter of your resolution, so it's independent of that. So basically what I have is I have two different build paths that I found. One I go versus physical damage opponents, one I go versus magic damage opponents. These are not absolutes. I will differ from them if I feel like it, if I think there is a better item to be had. And this is why I have the last block here, which is just strong items, either through practice or through statistics that I found that have their cases, right? Like, someone's gonna say Shen is not a good Meias user. I think there's cases where that's not the case. You can actually buy it. For sure, stuff like Redemption on Locket, if we look here overall across all items on Shen top lane, we notice these two items, even if their sample size is relatively low, they are strong items that have their spots. Especially, you can see both of these had the good with low gold tag. So what this means is that compared to purchases of every other item in the game, when you have low gold, these disproportionately increase your win probability. And I think that makes sense if you think about the game qualitatively, where, okay, if you're already behind, you're not gonna have, not gonna have the ability to kill opponents with a Titanic Hydra damage build. Whereas if you just buy a Redemption that has flat value for your team, it's gonna increase your win probability by more. That's kind of the qualitative understanding there. So I have situational items that I think have their purpose, and I have them ready here. And this is all just to make me not buy a bad item. That's like the number one thing. Like I don't even care about buying the optimal item in every game, but I know for a fact that if I don't have an item page set up, I can make the mistake of buying a bad item. Now, I don't think there's many examples in my match history because I'm kind of cooking here with Navori, but in general, if you haven't prepared your item set, how are you gonna make those decisions in the game itself when you don't have the ability to actually sit down, look at the data, think about what one tricks are doing? You just don't have the mental capacity, and what's gonna happen is you're gonna think, oh, I need magic resistance, Force of Nature is good. No, it's not. Like you just chose an item, you weren't prepared to make that choice, and that's gonna cost you some chances of winning the game. I think that's the fundamental thing that we're doing here.
Okay. And then in terms of the item sets themselves, so I love the like building components and stuff like that. Would you recommend laying it out like this? Because the other way that I'm thinking about it is you have your first set, which is like your useful items in most games, like your Deadman's in this example. And then could you just have a set of these are good magic resist items for Shen? These are good tank armor ones for Shen. Because I really like that approach. I think, again, if we compare it to pro play, which is obviously where I'm biased from, the perfect item sometimes actually is absolutely game breaking, and it might be weird. An example we had from our series against Lost Returns is, personally, I think Varus going Zhonya's was the absolute perfect item, and it really did make the enemy have zero way to play the game anymore. But in general, you would only like lose games by exactly what you say. I just bought bad items, not the most optimal item we have to buy every single time, but I just bought bad ones. So is it ever useful to just have, okay, here's just items which are currently good for MR for my champ?
I think that's a completely valid approach, and I think these are not absolutes, right? Because you have 100 different ways of building these item sets. I think what the primary philosophy here is that you just need to have a way of being systematically prepared to make those choices. And if for you as a player, it is more convenient to have it laid out like this, where you're like, oh, well, I have basically, you can think of it like, I have 3 magic resist options. And this is now, just based on data, you let's say we drop that, we might see Abyssal Mask somewhere here. Oh, it's actually bad. Oh, never mind. But it's low sample size. I think Abyssal Mask definitely has its games. And if you look at the situational stats, you can see when it's both versus magic damage, and one thing that we are missing here is with magic damage, right?
With magic, yeah.
I think I've legit won like a couple of games just by buying this item, because I have a Fed Gwen on my team, right? And all I need to do is provide 12% increased damage to the incredibly fed AP carry in my team, and I'm going to be useful, right? So let's say I prepare like this. I have magic resist options, and there's kind of like clear situations when I go for each. I might even write them down. I'm like, Abyssal with AP carry, right? And then you might go Soraka, Janna, Ocean Soul, right? For Spirit Visage or something like this. Kind of like preparing out the conditions. And these might be based on your qualitative game understanding, where okay, this item synergizes well with healing. Or they might be based on stats, which I think this is really interesting to look at. But if you take all champions and look at Kainic Rooker here, this is incredible item versus high AP comps. It's just absolutely fantastic item. It's providing a 1% 1 percentage point probability increase in winning versus magic damage comps. And this classification is done by basically, we looked at the damage distribution of an average League of Legends game, and we looked at the top 33% games where there was the most amount of magic damage, right? So you're kind of dropping this into 3 buckets. And here you can see also that Kainic Rooker is being purchased more versus magic damage compositions, whereas it's being purchased less versus physical damage compositions. That was not my point, but the point was compared to other magic damage options, where this is, 0.6, that's still relatively high. Force of Nature, it's 0.7. You might think Force of Nature, well, this item grants the most magic resistance in the entire game, but it is conditional on stacking the item, where you need to be immobilized or hit by spells. Whereas Kainic Rooker just gives you 80 magic resistance flat out, and it gives you that Mage Bane magic damage shield. So even something like Abyssal Mask loses in favor of Kainic Rooker in games where the opponents have a lot of magic damage. But then again, Abyssal Mask has the added benefit of, let's say you have 2 magic damage carries. So yeah. So you might lay it out like this. Okay, these are my magic damage options, magic resistance options, and I'm just going to conditionally choose between these 3. And also what you can think about is, I can think about the components. So I might drop in the components like this. The reason being, this way, when I make that base, I can also think about which component I can afford the best, right? And which component serves me the best in this particular scenario. So even if the game warrants a Spirit Visage, because you have a healing support and you need magic resistance, it might be more beneficial to build towards Kainic Rooker, because you have a gold, you have a gold amount of 850 on your recall, and you need magic resistance for your next fight, right?
It's just going to be a big fight, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's a dragon fight coming. You only have armor until now, and they have a fed, AP damage dealer. So even if you want Spirit Visage, you would either have to go for Kindle Gem for that particular fight, or you would have to just buy a Null Magic Mantle, which gives you 25 less magic resistance. It might cause you to die, it might cause you to not get a kill, lose the dragon. So then the incremental benefit of having that synergy with your healing champion is kind of like overweighed by the better build path of the other item. So I think something like this could work very well, where you have the build path visible and you have kind of, let's say, classification of items. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I had some questions written down before we came in, but you kind of answered most of them. I love the approach of, you should think about stats, you should think about what one tricks are doing, and you should, very importantly, think for yourself.
Yeah.
Based on your own game understanding and preferences and stuff like that. I think that's really good. The one question I have, which I assume you get all the time, is how do you know what stats to ignore, other than ones that you've already filtered out for low sample size? Because you do on Coachless have the option to re-add in ones with super low sample size.
Yeah. I think
how do you find that?
Yeah.
No, it's just that is the question.
I think this raises a couple of thoughts. I will say one thing that I really like looking at, this I'm going to answer your question after this, but I just had it in mind, is this purchase time trend of items. And this is best seen when you take the item across all champions. And this is related to the sample size thing. So if in particular I'm interested in Shen itemizations, the problem with the naive approach of filtering items by I only want to look at Canik Ruckard only on Shen in a specific item slot is that for these particular data points that we see here, it's going to be like, oh, maybe there's 1,000 data points here, 1,000 data points here, right? Like there's just a little bit of data. And we actually made some experiments to see how the VPA, like the win probability added, is influenced by the sample size. And we noticed that after like, let's say 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 games, it becomes relatively stable. But during the first samples of 1,000 to 3,000 games, it's still relatively volatile. So something like this, where Frozen Heart has 1,000 sample size, I'm not gonna trust that. Like if I have good intuition on why this is not good on Shen, where you're wasting mana on the champion, there might be a situation where it's good. I'm not gonna trust that, right? So I'm looking generally for game counts of up to more than 5,000 games. Preferably, more is better, or rather, more is more reliable, right? There might be cases where you have, I think a good example is like when you start filtering by matchup even. Let's say you're interested in Aatrox versus tanks, right? And the number of games goes down significantly when you filter, okay, I know for a fact I'm going Sundered Sky first item. And now you see, okay, well, if we filter by Aatrox versus tanks, and I know first item is Sundered Sky, the game counts start to become relatively low. And now you say, okay, xPetu, you said you don't trust this number because it's less than 3,000. But if the context is narrowed down enough, and I have the ability to look outside of the context as well, and I see, okay, if you don't filter by that, Sterak's is still good. If we filter by that, Sterak's becomes even better. And then if we don't filter by the matchup, we see, okay, Sterak's is still good, right? Then I have the combination of, in general, this item is a good second item. And when we narrow down the context, it remains a good item. So it seems relatively stable, right? So then I start to trust that number more. This is something that is, I think, kind of like a big design issue for us, where we need to go through the numbers. We need to actually think about what's going to be reliable for the end user, where, for example, this particular button, I think a lot of players will use it or users will use it, but it's going to just create issues where this number is just not going to be trustworthy, right? And that's the reason why I usually hide these, because I don't want to look at that number that I know for a fact just has no like meaning, right? It's like mostly noise. So it's a very hard design issue of like, how do we create stats that can be instantly trusted, but also how do we educate the user on what to trust and what to not? And I think it's something that requires its own thoughts. I'm quickly going to return to the Canik Ruckard case, because I just wanted to show you this. I can search for that there. I want to show you that this particular item scales really well with time. So there are certain items like Abyssal Mask that are already, I mean, this one I wouldn't, like, we would have to implement of like how much sample size this guy has here to trust that. But like some items have a very clear trend of being worse in the early game and being better in the late game. And these trends are best visible when you take the highest data set possible. So, across all champions. Then there are items like Rageblade, for example. Rageblade is a fantastic item in the early game, but what happens is that its efficiency goes down extremely as the game goes on. And this is not intuitive, by the way. Like you might think that it's like
retroactively intuitive. But it's not intuitive until you look at the stats, because you just won't get to
that's a key word right there. Retroactively intuitive. After you've seen this stat, you can make the argument in your head.
I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah. This item gives you flat on hit damage. It gives you AD, AP, and a lot of attack speed in the early game, where fights are actually longer in the early game than they are in the late game, right?
Yeah, because it's harder to sit and stack up that item in the late game when anything one-shots you.
Exactly. But in the early game, you can hit the wave and have Seething Strike stacked up all the time, right? And even though, as a design, this is like on-hit capstone item, because you think,
it's a late game item on
yeah,
Blade.
exactly.
That's
You're
what
like,
it's supposed to be.
my on-hits are gonna be multiplied. So when I have my Blade of the Ruined King, right? When I have my Terminus, then the Rage Blade is gonna go really well, right? But that's not the case at all. Whereas it's a very good one-item spike, and you can see this for Static Shiv as well. Where Static Shiv is like a very strong wave clear early spike, but because it deals flat damage, it's just not going to be useful as the game goes on. And then you take an item such as Lord Dominic's Regards, and you're going to, obviously it hasn't been purchased in the early game at all, because no one yet is brave enough to go LDR first item, although I think Baus is doing it on Y top lane, but this particular item shines, for the whole mid to late game situation. And then something like Guardian's Angel is something that gets better as the game goes on. But looking at these kind of like item specific trends, it's better to take the large sample size across all champions rather than the added specificity of this item on your particular champion, because you can see the trends better when the sample size is large. Yeah.
Okay. That's really cool. That's like changed my thinking on Rageblade now.
It's but when you've seen this stat and you start thinking about it, I think you will notice it in game where it's like, this Rageblade, it is super strong first item, like a Kog'Maw with Rageblade first item, Varus with Rageblade first item. Those are massive champions, but late game it's just gonna get blown up immediately, right?
It's also as well like it's how much is the item and how much is the champion or something else. Where Kog'Maw on one item Rageblade is insane. Late game Kog'Maw is also really good. So you think Rageblade is good, but it actually might not be. And then actually maybe there's an example. There's a case in pro play when you've got 6 items. Oftentimes your AD ends up being still the one to clear the waves, because just the time it takes to clear the waves is really important. And you can be swapping out items. And I never don't think anyone has ever thought, well, Rageblade's bad in late game, so I'm swapping it out on something like Kog'Maw, but maybe it is,
Yeah, exactly. It might be worth to go Terminus, maybe a Guardian Angel, like the Zonias that we talked about previously.
It would never be the item that I would sell intuitively to swap for a luxury item like Zonia's, but that's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, but I think we'll wrap it up there. I think this is a topic that we could talk about for hours and hours, but if the viewers have a preference for more content, we can do that. But I think we got a good discussion going on here about item sets, items in general, stats, and the general philosophy of optimizing performance.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.